All right, hello everybody. We're going to wrap up the 1940s with this PowerPoint, talking about the foreign policy that develops while Harry Truman is president. So kind of just how the international scene changes following World War II. And there are some significant changes. And then also how the Cold War begins. And the Cold War will be the event that kind of dominates our foreign policy decisions till basically the 1990s. I think you could easily argue that relations with us and Russia right now are not exactly in possibly the best spot, in which case, the Cold War may have just taken a little hiatus in the 90s and early 2000s, and maybe under Vladimir Putin, things seem to be repeating themselves to a degree. So we'll see just kind of how all that starts changing as we look at the foreign policy of the 1940s following World War II under Harry Truman. All right, so Truman is going to basically have a major change from what we see with World War I. So in World War I, we were a very internationalist government under William McKinley and then Teddy Roosevelt and then William Howard Taft and then Woodrow Wilson. We went through 4 straight presidents that had an international focus, their foreign policy, generally imperialism, if you recall all that. But World War I kind of left us scarred, kind of left us disappointed with the results of all that. So in the 1920s, we moved back into more of an isolationist mindset, whereas there was a world court established, there was a League of Nations established. We generally try to avoid involvement. In fact, our involvement in the foreign policy in the 1920s, like the Washington Naval Conference, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the Dawes Plan, even though it still showed us having involvement with foreign countries, it was almost always for the ultimate goal of being able to disengage from foreign policy. But obviously, out of that isolationism came World War II. And so the U.S. under FDR, who kind of sets the tone for foreign policy in the late 30s and 40s, and then under Truman, who kind of picks up where FDR left off, we're going to actually not revert back to an isolationist mindset. There were a lot of people in America that wanted to, but with the Soviet Union becoming the large threat that it will be after World War II, the U.S. is going to stay involved in world affairs from then until, I would argue, the present. A little bit under Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford in the 60s and 70s, we're going to see an attempt to kind of disengage ourselves a little bit from foreign policy. Donald Trump got elected promising a slight disengagement from foreign policy, but even under all those presidents, we continue to stay fairly involved in most events in the world. So Truman's going to be this first president of kind of the modern era where the U.S. becomes this world power and stays involved out in the world. Okay. So what's going on that requires us to stay out in the world is there's basically a new world order. Like if you remember how the world functioned, like in the macro sense, prior to World War II, it was kind of this balance of power concept between Western European countries, mostly England, France, and Germany, to see who was going to rule the world. At one point it was Spain, at one point it was the Dutch, but for the last 200 years it had been England and France, who's going to win, and then Germany rose up and who's going to win between them. And so we just see these conflicts go back and forth, whether it was the Franco-Prussian War or World War I, very famously. A little bit earlier era, we had the Crimean War that just showed some kind of unsettlement in European politics. All the rivalries over colonization that lead to World War I, and then obviously World War II. Now, after World War II, most of those major powers are destroyed, and they really just aren't going to be able to recover anytime soon. And the only 2 countries to come out of it, I don't want to say unscathed, but at least with a significant amount of power, because both countries obviously got hurt in very significant ways, are going to be the United States on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. And the United States, obviously, we've been learning a lot about them, are a democratic capitalist nation, and the Soviet Union by this point is clearly a totalitarian, socialistic, communistic, authoritarian regime. And so we're going to see these 2 very different worldviews. And the thing with both of them is both of them in this era are trying to spread their mindset, whereas the Soviets are trying to infiltrate new countries and gain allies and build up a power base. And just kind of spread this communistic ideology they have, or at the very least their power structure, if not the ideology. The United States, on the other hand, is going to be doing the same, in large part because we've been doing that in the era of imperialism, so this is not new to us, but also because we're trying to head off the Soviets of the past and prevent them from gaining influence. And so this relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union is going to be what drives these foreign policy decisions for the next 70 years, basically. All right, now the very first thing that Truman has to deal with in foreign policy is he's got to deal with the defeated Axis. And this is actually a pretty important topic, the Axis, the term for Germany, Italy, and Japan. in World War II. And if you remember, the Central Powers were not dealt with appropriately or correctly or effectively after World War I, which prompted a stage being set for them to obviously end up following crazy leaders that go on and do really heinous and terrible things. So they're going to try to correct some of those mistakes. And the first thing we're going to see is what to do with Germany. Now, with Germany, the primary thing that the Allied powers, U.S. and Russia and the British, were trying to deal with, and the French to a degree, is what do you do with them? Because they left them alone the last time. They made them pay reparations and whatnot after World War I, but they did not occupy them. They did not kind of force them to restructure government. They created this Weimar Republic that attempted to do it, but it obviously was weak, and in the economic collapse of the late 20s and 30s, it disappeared, and out of that came Hitler and the Nazi Reich. So they're going to try to prevent that from happening. And what they agreed to at the Yalta Conference, which we learned about, was that there would be an occupation of Germany. And then what they did at the Potsdam Conference that we learned about in World War II is that there's going to be a map that is going to demonstrate the occupation. So what you see on this map is the different zones. You got the British zone, which is up here in Germany. You've got the American zone down here in Germany. You've got the French zone, which are these two blue parts. Okay, and then you've got the Russian zone, the Soviet zone, which is up here. Okay, and then right there where the cursor is, you have Berlin. And Berlin is obviously the capital of Germany. These parts of Germany are going to be separated and given to Poland and the Soviet Union up there. Okay, but Berlin is going to become the front lines of the Cold War. As if you look real carefully, you can see that there is a Russian zone, Soviet zone, and then a American, French, and British zone all on the west side. So West Berlin is going to become the democratic kind of capital of Europe, so to speak, at least in the world's view of the Cold War developing in Europe. And then the Soviet zone, East Berlin, going to be kind of the mindset. And then by 1961, when John F. Kennedy's president, a wall is going to be built that divides them. And most people have heard of the Berlin Wall if they don't know what it is. But this map that shows how Germany's being occupied was created at the Potsdam Conference, is now being implemented after the war. Japan, on the other hand, it wasn't as big a deal because Japan really had only been conquered by the United States. So there's no map there. The whole country of Japan is going to be occupied temporarily by the United States, with General Douglas MacArthur functioning as military governor general, where he's going to oversee them. And what he does as leader of Japan, he basically tries to kind of shift their cultural political mindset away from the old traditional Bushido codes of the samurai and try to redirect it more towards the business world. And they're going to bring over American car companies. They're going to bring over American electronic companies. And they're going to start teaching the Japanese, whereas it used to be an agricultural society that was kind of militant, aggressive, as we saw in the late early 1900s, as it was trying to industrialize. Now we're trying to encourage them, say, no, to apply this competitive spirit, apply this spirit of conquest and just the code of Bushido and just other cultural things you learn about in Japanese history. Apply them to the business mindset. And so they do, and they start to develop car companies. Eventually, skip ahead a couple decades, you're going to have like a Honda and a Toyota and a Nissan and whatnot. And they start to develop electronic companies like Sony and then many other companies down the road. But this kind of comes out of the U.S. occupation of Japan. And this was obviously a very successful approach as compared to World War I, in that both Germany, at least the western part of Germany, is going to become a very close ally throughout most of U.S. history from this point forward, even though there's been some little disruptions and hiccups in President Trump's administration. And then Japan has been a very strong ally of the United States from this point forward, with generally pretty good relations on both sides. Little hiccup here or there, but the Japanese and the U.S. still very large trade partners that tend to get along more often than they don't. Okay, so that's going to be very successful. And then the other major thing that has to occur, and is very famous in history, are the war crime trials. Because obviously a lot of crimes against humanities, or humanity, I should say, occurred during World War II on both sides of the world, with the Germans obviously committing many atrocities that we sort of sum up in the word the Holocaust. And then the Japanese also had several atrocities as well. And we're going to see different ways of how those are dealt with. Okay, and the first is the Nuremberg trials, a very famous series of trials that take place over the course of about a year and a half in Nuremberg, Germany, where basically leaders of the Nazi Reich are put on trial as the people who gave the orders to conduct the Holocaust. Okay, and so we're going to see many of the most famous Nazi leaders, Hitler being accepted as he committed suicide, so he was dead and could not be put on trial. But many of the other ones, like Hermann Goering, Goebbels, some of the other leaders of the Nazis that people might have heard of, and they're all put on trial. Many of them use the defense that, hey, we can't be held accountable. We were just following Hitler's orders. But in this trial, the leaders of these tribunals basically suggest that's unacceptable. Like, you can't follow these orders. Like, if you get executed for not following the orders, so be it. But it is never acceptable to do this to people. One criticism of the Nuremberg trials is a lot of people say they didn't go far enough, as they only punished leadership. And now the 21 put on trial, I want to say, I believe 12 were sentenced to death. Many others were given really long prison terms. But a lot of people say that's just not enough punishment, given the amount of loss that occurred. Because, I mean, depending on what book you read and how they define the word the Holocaust, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 11.5 million people were obviously killed in very heinous ways. In which case, there are those who say that this punishment is just not close enough, given the amount of atrocity that occurred. And some people say, so why would that be? One idea offered up by historians is that the Americans who oversaw the Nuremberg trials, for the most part, didn't really want to punish too many people in Germany, as the Cold War was developing, and it was evident that there was going to be a lot of tension, a lot of conflict in Europe. Some historians suggest that basically the U.S. was trying to curry favor, especially with the West Germans, and so we didn't want to just execute every single person that had something to do with the Holocaust, from the leaders of the Nazi government all the way down to the prison guards who themselves committed many of these atrocities. But either way, the trials were the trials. They resulted in what they resulted in, and it just shows how the Allies were attempting to address some of the atrocities that occurred during the war. And there's a picture of one of the days of the Nuremberg trials. You can see some of the people in the front who were interpreters for the most part. Okay, and now we also have the Tokyo trials, which took place over 5 years. And many more people are going to be put on trial over in Tokyo. And these are going to be punishing the Japanese for things they did. Some of the atrocities they committed in China, which is kind of a sore spot, as there are still deniers in the Japanese government today that claim the atrocities that Japanese leaders were accused of ordering and committing in China never happened. Famous events like the rape of Nanking, where thousands and thousands and thousands of people were exterminated in really awful ways. Also, the crimes they committed against us, where like the Bataan Death March, where on the Philippines, after they took them over, they marched a bunch of U.S. prisoners of war, and if any of them slowed down, they would decapitate them or kill them or torture them. And they did a lot of this torture to prisoners during in these war camps. And so hundreds of Japanese officials will be executed. Thousands will be put on trial and punished. The most famous will be him, that's Hideki Tojo, who was sentenced to death as a result of the Tokyo trials. And historians have said, so why were so many Japanese leaders killed as opposed to so few German leaders? And again, what some historians suggest is that Japan, we were not as concerned about the Cold War coming to, as it was an island. It was separated for the most part from the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union obviously goes all the way to the east, up to northeastern China. That at the time, we did not think the Cold War would spread to Japan, so we were more willing to punish people in this country, thinking that there was less need of having so much political capital. But either way, the trials did what they did, and these are all examples of how Harry Truman and the U.S. military and government are trying to address the defeated Axis powers, punish the people that were in power for some of the bad things, and then occupy these countries. So on some level, there were successes. On some level, there were certainly some limitations. But this is one of the differences between World War II and World War I. Okay, here's some pictures from the Nuremberg trials, just random food for thought type things. I think one of the most interesting quotes to come out of the trial, it's certainly worth reading and reflecting on, as basically when Hermann Goering, who was basically the vice president of the Nazi government, second in charge behind Adolf Hitler, they were asked, they said, the German people, I mean, certainly there's been a history of some prejudice in Germany, that goes without saying, but they're also a very educated nation. So, like, how do you take a very educated nation, of very smart people, and in essence brainwash them into supporting something like the Holocaust? And as you read the quote, he's basically saying, it doesn't matter how smart people are, it's easy to brainwash people in a democracy. It's easy to brainwash people in any form of government. You can bring them along, not just like scare them into submission, but actually get them to support it. And so as I read it, I find it a little bit convicting as you look at our country and some of the bad things that have obviously occurred in our past. And it makes you wonder if Hermann Goering, even though he was wrong morally on basically every single thing he did in his adult life that we know of, he's probably right on this, that this is a concept that even a democracy like ours, people need to have caution. People need to, consider our leaders and the things they say, the prejudices they play upon. And you see this both on the left and the right. So it's concerning. And then here are some of the Nazi leaders as they are hearing their sentence read, which obviously many of them were executed. And this is going to be a disappointing result for them, but certainly a logical consequence given what was happening. But either way, these are the Nuremberg trials, very famous events. You can read whole books on, but in a survey class like this, it becomes a bullet point with a couple pictures. All right, so now we move on to another thing that Truman wanted to accomplish. And this was something that FDR wanted to accomplish. If you remember, Woodrow Wilson was an internationalist. Woodrow Wilson said, I'm going to be a progressive. I'm going to, fix the economy, but I'm also going to fix the world scene. I have my 14 points. I have my League of Nations. I'm going to try to create a new world order by which there can be peace and that there will never be war again. And FDR was going to do what Wilson did, and Truman's going to continue the goal of FDR in trying to maintain this thing. So whereas after World War I, we had a World Court and a League of Nations and a few other little odds and ends, we're going to see even more after World War II. So go back to 1944, FDR is still alive. World War II is in its last full year, but it's in the process of wrapping up at this point. And there was a conference at Bretton Woods. And so what happens at the Bretton Woods conference is some of these meetings between the leaders of the democracies trying to figure out how these new international peacekeeping organizations we can develop and how they can promote world peace. Out of the Bretton Woods conference comes the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And basically what these two organizations do, if I'm oversimplifying them dramatically, which I am, is they basically exist in such a way to financially try to prop up nations to keep them from having epic, catastrophic failures, because when an economy just catastrophically fails, it opens the door to people like Mussolini or Hitler or some of these other crazy leaders to rise up. And so the IMF and the World Bank's mission, in essence, is not necessarily to make sure every country is rich and every country has tons of resources, but just to prevent these massive failures of countries. And we've seen them active, like in the 2008 recession, we saw them prop up the Greek government and the Italian government, and I think the Spanish government a little bit. And I'm sure if the economic panic that we're living through or appears to be developing right now, we will probably hear some from the IMF and the World Bank about trying to keep this country or that country from collapsing. And so again, they are international organizations created for financial and economic means of propping up countries in order to promote world peace. Okay, a much more famous example of this is going to be the development of the United Nations, a very long, complicated story that goes all the way back to 1941, the Atlantic Charter meeting between Winston Churchill and FDR, when they discussed, okay, so the war is obviously developing. Hitler has done what he's done by 41. The U.S. had not joined the war at this point, but they were about to, and they knew it. So they were talking about, so what is our goal for the war? And one of the things they agreed the goal was to, like Woodrow Wilson said, make the world safe for democracy. We needed an international organization to promote world peace that actually was effective, unlike the League of Nations. And we also needed basically a code that the League of Nations, that is now going to be called the United Nations, will stand by. So just these rules. And the rules that the UN will be propped up on are going to be what FDR called the four freedoms: the freedom of speech for all people in the world, the freedom of religion for all people in the world, the freedom from fear of all people in the world, and the freedom from want or lacking basic needs. And that's basically going to be the mission of the United Nations. And it's going to be called the United Nations because at the Atlantic Charter meeting, when Churchill and FDR signed and agreed upon the document that sort of laid the groundwork for this later UN that's going to develop, they signed it as the British and the Americans, the United Nations. So these two countries that are united in this goal, and that title stuck, and obviously we still use it today. So what is the UN? The UN is obviously going to be this new organization. You've probably seen their flag before. There it is. That has a different structure than the League. Okay, the League had a general council where all the member nations met. They discussed problems. And if they ever voted and said, hey, so this country shouldn't be doing that, then every member nation was supposed to join in, but that didn't actually work. So the UN is going to be structured a little different, where they're going to have a general council where pretty much every country in the world is going to have representatives, but they're also going to have a security council within that general council. And the Security Council will have 12 nations in it, 7 of them rotating every 2 years, 5 of them permanent. And the 5 of them that are permanent are the United States, the British, the French, the Chinese, and the Soviet Union. And these are the 5 permanent members because they were the 5 allies from World War II. Okay, and the 5 permanent members will also have a very important power where within the Security Council, if, say, a country like Australia arbitrarily decides to start a war with New Zealand, even though that would probably just about never happen in the modern era, the UN would then vote. What do we do about this? And it would be the Security Council that would actually do the vote. It would be the Security Council that creates the army, creates the plan to keep security, and the UN keeps a permanent peacekeeping force available. So unlike the League of Nations that had to rely on volunteers for member nations, the UN has its own peacekeeping force. It's not a massive army by any stretch, but it's big enough to go in and do some basic peacekeeping missions. For any massive actions, they're going to have to enlist volunteers from the member countries. But all the 5 permanent members, the US, the British, the French, the Soviets, and the Chinese, have a veto power. So anything the Security Council says, hey, we need to stop Australia from invading New Zealand or whatever might be going on, any member of the League of Nations could say, nope, we're gonna say, or I shouldn't say of the League of Nations, of those 5 permanent members of the Security Council can veto it and say, no, that's not actually going to happen. And the U.S. actually insisted on that being in there because if you remember, the reason the U.S. did not want to join the League of Nations was we didn't want other countries to force us to get involved with stuff. So by us having a veto power made us more willing to support the mission of this. And the UN will be headquartered in New York City, where it still resides today. I would guess some of you have probably been there as a tourist before. But whatever, it is what it is. And the UN is going to have some very important early accomplishments. I don't want to say successes because there is some debate in the world today and back then with what they accomplished, but they still accomplished things that they set out to do. And so, for better or worse, these things will be viewed as an example of how the UN was a more effective organization than the League of Nations was. One of them is where decolonization. We don't spend any time talking about this in American history, but it's one of the biggest topics from World War II, where basically all the colonial empires, not all, but the vast majority of them are broken up after World War II because a lot of the colonial imperial powers were also destroyed during World War II. And so a lot of countries, as they were decolonizing, meaning like losing their government, that, most famously the British, who gave up a lot of their colonies because they had so many colonies to give up at this time, the UN will help make sure that a lot of these processes actually go pretty smoothly. Probably the most famous example was India. India, very large country, obviously, that was going to be split up. The British plan for leaving India, to oversimplify a very complicated story, was to create 2 states, the state of India, which would be predominantly Hindu, and the state of Pakistan. There's going to be a West Pakistan and an East Pakistan initially that will both be predominantly Muslim. Okay, and this ended up being not the smoothest process, especially when it looked like a war was going to break out between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, a city that was close to the border, that both felt they wanted because both had large numbers of people in Kashmir, and it looked like a conflict might break out between the 2 countries. UN peacekeeping forces went in, maintained peace, kind of came up with a compromise whereby both sides were relatively happy, so to speak, even though there were a lot on both sides that weren't thrilled with it. But either way, that is an example of how the UN kept peace and prevented a war. One thing it didn't succeed in would be like Indochina, a French colony that today we would call Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, where the UN encouraged the French to decolonize and create new countries, and they didn't. And that's going to lead to a lot of tension, a lot of conflict in that region that honestly, to a degree, still some problems occurring there today, some very significant ones. So that was something the UN maybe could have addressed better, but didn't. And the French holding veto power would have prevented the Security Council from doing anything about that anyway. Okay, another thing they did was the UN helped craft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, kind of this mission statement for the United Nations that they still more or less cling to. Eleanor Roosevelt played a large role in helping write this, helping codify it, helping craft it, and it's basically the mission statement of the UN that still this day is generally lauded by the vast majority of people in the world, and it's basically a codified version of those 4 freedoms we addressed a couple minutes ago. Okay, another accomplishment that's going to have some significant short-term and long-term consequences was when the UN plays a key role in helping to reestablish Israel as a nation state. So Israel, many of you probably aware, was a country long, long ago before the dispersal of the Roman Empire, where they took the Jewish members of Israel and dispersed them all around the Roman Empire to try and prevent the revolutions that have been breaking out periodically in that country. And ever since then, there really hadn't been a nation of Israel. There had been a Jewish people, obviously, all around the world, but the nation itself more or less was gone. It had been a province of the Ottoman Turkish Empire and the Roman Empire at different times, and the Seljuk Turks, I believe, controlled it at one point. It was called Palestine by the Romans, so that ended up kind of being a name that stuck for the next couple thousand years. But as we move into the 20th century, we talked about during World War II the rise of the Zionist movement, like especially in the 1800s. But it really gets big in the United States in the 20th century under the leadership of people like Louis Brandeis. And so, obviously, following atrocities like the Holocaust that drew a lot of attention to the plight of Jewish people around the world, especially in Europe, and especially just some of the heinous things that happen to them, whether it was the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, whether it's obviously the Holocaust in Central Europe. There was just a lot of sympathy for the Jewish people. And so the cause of Zionism is going to be honored by the United Nations when they establish Israel. So they send a group there to kind of work out an agreement between the Palestinian Arabs that live there and the Jewish people that were trying to move there. There were already some Jewish people living there prior to this, but a lot more were trying to, many from the United States, many from Europe, and a few other spots around the world. But either way, the UN sends this peacekeeping force in an attempt to establish it. And it ended up being a very controversial thing. The leader of it, who was a Swedish guy who was there to basically negotiate between the two sides, was actually assassinated. And as he got assassinated, it looked like this whole attempt to create this nation of Israel and just to compromise with the Palestinian Arabs that live there as far as what the state would looked like it was going to fall apart. Okay. Now, what ends up happening, though, by 47, the UN actually comes up with a plan. And if you look at this map, okay, this is the plan they come up with, where basically all this green area is going to be area that is more or less autonomous to a degree. With Palestinian Arabs. So you have, like what today we would call the West Bank, which is kind of this area here. You have the Gaza Strip and the area that extends down to here. And then obviously you have this northwestern province up here. Okay, now Jerusalem is a very important city to both the Palestinian Arabs and Muslims in general, and a lot of world religions, and also Jewish people, because it was just a very famous place. The Mount Zion that is famous for Jerusalem is where the temple was, so it was a very important holy place for Jewish people, and it also is the place where the Dome of the Rock is for Muslim worshippers, which is a place where Muhammad, I believe did he rise up to heaven or something along those lines. So basically, it's an exceedingly important spot. And so this was a source of tension with who would have control. And obviously, it's right in the midst of the Palestinian section and the initial layout of the plan in 47. And so that was one of the reasons why the Swedish guy was actually killed. He was killed by a Jewish nationalist who was very unhappy, obviously, that he thought Jerusalem would not be accessible to Jewish worshippers. And so out of this plan, there needed to be some compromise. And one of the compromises, as you can see, is this yellow dot that surrounds Jerusalem, where basically Jerusalem would end up being, according to the initial draft of the UN plan, a international city where anybody could be there. Muslim Arabs, Jewish Israelites, Christians could be there. Anybody, basically. The suburbs and the city itself would be this international city that was open to anyone. Now, that didn't necessarily satisfy a lot of people, so there's going to be more compromises over time, and those compromises are going to be led by this man named Ralph Bunche. There's a picture of him right there. Okay, but Ralph Bunche is going to be the guy who basically is why this compromise is affected. He is the guy that picks up the pieces from when the Swedish leader was assassinated, and he's the guy that actually gets both sides to agree to this map. And then as more compromises occur, the map develops into this map, where basically what you end up with is the nation of Israel is all this white part, and see how there's this little cutout now that where physically there is a connection to the nation of Israel and Jerusalem, right there, that access point. But it's also a map that allows the Palestinian Arabs to have a significant amount of land, the Gaza Strip over here, and then the West Bank over here. And over time, there's obviously going to be a lot of changes and a lot of developments and a lot of conflict on both sides regarding these developments. But the fact that a compromise even could occur in these early years and a debate that has such strong views on both sides, any of you familiar with world events today are aware of that, this was significant. This was impressive, and this was something that will actually earn Ralph Bunche a Nobel Peace Prize. So Ralph Bunche will earn the Nobel Peace Prize, and he will stand out in history as he was the first African American to win a Nobel Peace Prize, and he got it for overseeing the establishment of Israel in this case, and actually maintaining peace between both sides, because there was a lot of disappointment on both sides with the map, but the fact that both sides did actually agree to it, and it created I don't want to say a peaceful situation, because obviously there's been a ton of conflict over there, but possibly a more peaceful result than might have occurred otherwise. It's hard to say. But either way, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so it once again shows that the UN set out to accomplish something, and whereas it's going to leave a lot of people disappointed on both sides, it still effectively accomplished one of its goals. And so this was a very big result. And this is also kind of the birth of a lot of the conflict that we're going to see later in the Middle East, where a lot of the conflict we're going to see is going to be driven by the Cold War in the Middle East, obviously energy resources in the Middle East, and we're especially going to see this as we move into the late 60s and early 70s. But a lot of it stems back to this time period where the UN, which was viewed as being led by like Western European countries that were predominantly Christian, are going to come in and kind of establish a nation state that is predominantly Jewish. And so that's going to be used by a lot of leaders in certain countries, whether the country is Egypt for a while, or Syria at different points, or Iran in the more modern era. But these are going to be things that are going to be used by leaders in these countries to kind of help spur antagonism of Western democracies, especially the United States. And obviously, there'll be a lot of conflicts between these countries and Israel. So this is a very important turning point in world affairs, and we will talk about some of these events down the road as they pertain to the United States. So when the U.S. is not involved with them, they don't show up in U.S. history class so much, but we will still learn about them to a degree. So the UN is obviously going to be this very important organization that changes the direction of history and is doing a lot more, is a lot more effective agency than we see the League of Nations being. Okay, and the last thing we're going to see is the Geneva Convention, which is just this convention of people that meet together and come up with agreements from time to time. They're going to reestablish new rules. If you go back to the Crimean War afterwards, which we were not involved with, so we didn't learn about it in this class, was one of the first Geneva Conventions that said all countries have to basically treat prisoners of war well. And then you go ahead to World War I. They reestablished Geneva Convention protocol to say you got to help. You cannot target medical and religious personnel. But then after World War II, they're going to add to the Geneva Convention that you cannot target civilians, that no civilians can be targeted in wartime. Like you can't bomb them, you can't execute them, whether you're talking about us dropping atomic bombs on Japan, or the Germans carpet bombing London during the Battle of Britain, or obviously a lot of the things that occurred in the Holocaust where the German army and other battalions were going around just executing civilians on sight. But the Geneva Convention is saying that can't happen, and setting up punishments that are not easily employed, not easily enforced, but it still shows how the world is agreeing to these things, saying, yes, we as a world need to respond differently to these things. Okay, so now one of the most famous events that's going to take place during Truman's early foreign policy is going to be that the Cold War develops. And the Cold War did not necessarily need to develop, but it did. And the Cold War is just this term we use for the tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, democratic and capitalist nations on the one hand, and communist nations on the other, that are going to basically set the tone for a lot of the foreign policy of the United States and the Soviet Union for the next 50 to 70 years, depending on how you want to look at it. Okay, so the Cold War is going to be this period where there's lots of tension and there's lots of subtle conflict, but no real open fighting. A lot of the fighting is going to be done through proxies, whether it's the Korean War where the Soviets and the Chinese will become communists. Spoiler alert here. whether they support North Korea and then we support the South Koreans, or whether they support the North Vietnamese, we support the South Vietnamese, or many other situations. So there are going to be proxy wars that involve us and the Soviets, but never direct war, never direct military engagements. So that's why they call it a Cold War. It's more like this period of mistrust and tension, but no real actual fighting. Okay, so why does it develop? Well, in 1946, it didn't. And whereas we did not trust the Soviets, we also didn't necessarily think that a Cold War was going to develop as much as it would. And that's one of the reasons we demilitarized so quickly. But in this 1947, we start to see these free elections that were promised at the Yalta Conference. And the first two countries that quickly turn out not to be free are Poland and Czechoslovakia. Poland and Czechoslovakia both had elections. In both elections, the Democratic candidates won. So Czechoslovakia and Poland are saying, we want to be democracy, we want to be capitalist. And yet the Soviets immediately say, no, there was fraud in the election. We're going to get involved in the election process and basically make sure these elections are honest and actually free. Whereas in reality, the elections are more or less honest and free. Now they aren't. And in the new elections, with Soviet tanks and soldiers sitting at many of the polling places, ironically, the communist governments will win these elections. And you've probably never heard before that the Soviets or the Russians have ever decided to limit democracy by getting involved in elections. That's probably never been an idea that ever crossed your mind before. But this is an example of how the Soviet Union certainly was doing this back in the post-World War II period. And so with that, we now realize, wow, if we don't do something about it, the Soviets are going to expand. They're going to stop a lot of these countries from being democratic. And this especially gets big, whereas in 1947, or was it 48, Winston Churchill, who's been deposed in the British government, very good war leader, they tell us, not so good peacetime leader, so he gets voted out. So now he's trying to make money by going around giving speeches. And he gives a speech in Missouri at a small college where he basically says, as you look at the world today, a lot of people are happy, World War II's over. But he's like, trust me, it is not over. And if you look at Europe, it appears that there is an iron curtain descending across it. And this iron curtain separates, that runs from basically eastern Italy up to the Baltic Sea, where on the eastern side of it, you got you don't have democracy. On the eastern side of it, you have a communism, an authoritarianism, and just really awful lifestyles that people should not generally want or desire. And on the west side, you have democracy and capitalism and hope. And this iron curtain is descending. Now, he's not talking about the Berlin Wall. This political cartoon we see here is not the Berlin Wall. That doesn't get built for another 14 years in Berlin. It's more just this imaginary kind of symbolic idea that Europe is becoming two societies. In the East, it's becoming communist, as Poland and Czechoslovakia were both on the eastern side of this, and on the west, it was not. And this starts to kind of just raise awareness amongst American people that, hey, maybe we need to take these Soviets serious. Okay, and that's going to especially become an issue when we see the Soviets starting to look at France, Italy, Greece, and Turkey, four countries that were all about to have elections, all about to try and rebuild, and we receive intelligence that tells us not only are they about to have elections, but much like we saw with Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1947, Joseph Stalin has his eyes on them. So basically what Stalin's trying to do is set up communist countries, which by this point, he occupies Eastern Germany. That was part of the Potsdam Conference. He has swayed the election in Poland to create a communist government. He swayed the election in Czechoslovakia to create a communist government. Yugoslavia votes for a communist government. They don't follow the Soviets. They follow communism. They're going to have a famous leader named Tito, who actually will have a lot of tension with Stalin because Tito, he has his own limitations on human rights at times. But he's not somebody that wanted to be a puppet of Stalin. Okay, Bulgaria will be militarily occupied by the Soviets, so they don't really have a choice. They're going to also become a Soviet puppet state. So basically, Eastern Europe is all becoming communist. West Germany we weren't as concerned about as we occupied them. But now we're looking at France, we're looking at Italy, we're looking at Greece, and we're looking at Turkey. And these are all four countries that have been decimated by World War II, just absolutely destroyed. And we were afraid that these countries and their just abject poverty that had developed and their broken, physically and economically broken countries, that would make people broke enough to turn to a Soviet or communist ideology. And when we found out Stalin actually had agents in France, Italy, Greece, and Turkey trying to create civil wars that would lead to a communist revolution, that's when we decided we've got to get involved. And so this is really the birth of the Cold War, where the Soviets were aggressive. Winston Churchill says, hey, open up your eyes, things are happening. And then we look at France, Italy, Greece, and Turkey and say, okay, we have to get involved before all of Europe turns into a communist country. And so we do. And what we're going to do becomes known as the idea of containment, an idea created by George Kennan. George Kennan was our ambassador to Moscow during this time period. And Truman, to oversimplify a long story, sent him a long letter that was basically like, so what do we do? How do we stop the Soviets from expanding? Because we don't want a war. We don't want to start nuking them. We don't want to, kill millions of people in an effort to stop this. We want a different way. And George Kennan sends back a response where he signs it X. So sometimes it becomes called like the article X or the letter X. And he signed it X because he didn't want to put his name on it for fear that if the Soviets found out he'd written this letter, that they might arrest him or execute him, as he was physically standing in the middle of the Soviet Union in Moscow. And Kennan basically said, you don't need to defeat the Soviets. You don't need to attack them. You don't need to use your military. You don't need to nuke them. All you need to do is contain them, keep them from spreading. He said, because communism doesn't work. He said, economically, it doesn't work. He said, what's going to happen? They took over these Eastern European countries. They're going to use them. They're going to drain all their resources. Money's going to flow back to Moscow. That's going to keep the people of Moscow in relative comfort. And they're going to prop up the Russian government. And as long as they can do this, they will. And they'll keep expanding. Now, what they do to these areas they expand into, they destroy them. They impoverish them. And so he said, just stop them from expanding. If you stop them from expanding, you can keep them from having resources. And if you keep them from having resources, they will have a revolution from within that will overthrow them. And so Kennan says, just do that. And he also says, you don't need to use the military. The best way to do this is just use your money. America, you're rich. So just prop up the economies of other countries, and other countries will not stupidly want to get involved in a communist mindset. And so out of this comes the Truman Doctrine, where Truman's going to read this letter written by George Kennan encompassing the idea of containment. And Truman's going to say, you know what we can do? We can basically have the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act, if you remember, was us sending money and food and military resources to all the countries that were fighting against the bad guys. Well, now the bad guys are the Soviet Union, the communists. So the Truman Doctrine says we will use all things short of troops to prop up free countries trying to stop communism from spreading. And the reason he does this is because in 1947, as we already suggested, it looked like Greece and Turkey were about to collapse. And so we send them over $400 million of aid, much of it military aid, much of it just straight money, so that these two democratic governments can prop themselves up. And under the $400 million of aid, Greece and Turkey will actually stop communist revolutions from happening. And they will develop a rebuilt country, and they will have a better economy, and they will continue to be a capitalist and democratic society. So for the low cost of $400 million, which that is low compared to what a war would have cost had we needed to go over there with our own military, we prevented communism from spreading in two important countries. And so with that, well, at least temporarily, if you know anything about the modern history of Turkey and Putin's role in propping up some of their leadership and some of the issues going on in that part of the world, there's a little bit of issue today where Russia is still trying to gain influence down in that part of the world. And so maybe it hasn't gone away, but Truman at least put it off for a long time. And so now Truman's saying, hey, that actually worked. And so what his Secretary of State is told to do, George Marshall, if you remember from the last set of notes I posted, George Marshall is going to be the guy he was like overall commander of Allied forces in World War II. And now he's Truman's Secretary of State, and he comes up with the Marshall Plan. And what the Marshall Plan is, it's going to be like the Truman Doctrine in Greece and Turkey, but applied to every nation in Europe. Any nation that wants to rebuild, we will help them rebuild. We will spend millions and millions and millions of dollars, as this political cartoon shows, where it's basically us just throwing money at Europe, saying, hey, we will help you rebuild. We will rebuild your society. Okay, in order to kind of make you wealthy. And if you're wealthier, you will be less likely to turn to communism. And what you see here is Stuttgart, a city in Germany, okay, West Germany, where on the left side you can see what it looked like after World War II. We had completely decimated the city. We had bombed it into nothing. It looks almost like one of those Hiroshima or Nagasaki. We didn't use nuclear device on Stuttgart, but we bombed it so much that there was basically no city left. Well, how do you rebuild a city in 8 years? This is a picture of it in 1955. Well, it looks like a modern city again, and a much nicer city than it used to be in some ways. Well, that involved millions and millions and millions of dollars from the Marshall Plan. And so by doing that, we're rebuilding these societies so they don't have to turn to desperate measures. And this map shows you all the countries we gave Marshall Plan money to. And the red bar on each country just shows you the ratio of how much we gave them. And so, as you can tell, we were giving money. And we offered this money to everybody. We even offered it to the countries of Eastern Europe. We even offered it to the Soviet Union, but they all refused to take it because the Soviets told them basically, you're not allowed to take it. And they more or less control these countries because they said this is just an attempt of the U.S. to buy you as friends and allies, which the Soviets were right. That is absolutely what it was. And so I guess from their perspective, it was right of them to say, don't take the money. But these are going to be the countries that took it. And it worked. Every one of these countries that took Marshall Plan money rebuilds, has a much better economy than it did at the time of World War II, and is going to become a close ally of the U.S. for many, many, many decades. Really, we've been close allies with all these countries, with one little hiccup in the 1950s. Until the modern era. In the last 3 years, we've seen some antagonism in our relationship with a lot of these countries. And I won't tell you why or how that is. We'll just have to save that for later. But if you've turned on the news in the last 3 years, you've probably heard some of this. But either way, the Marshall Plan was really effective. And another example of this is going to be how we handle the Berlin crisis. So in 1948, the Soviets are not led by stupid people. Joseph Stalin is not a fool. He's crazy. He's ruthless. He's immoral. But he's not a complete idiot. He recognized Truman was in a tough spot. He recognized that Truman domestically was struggling, that his political party, the Democrats, were splitting three ways, as we learned about in the last set of notes. You know, the Dixiecrats from the South, the progressives with Henry Wallace. And so he thought, man, well, let me just serve him up a foreign policy crisis that he can mismanage, and this will cost him the election. And so what he does is he implements the Berlin crisis. What the Berlin crisis was when he looked at Berlin, and if you remember on the map, Berlin was the city that was in the middle of Eastern Germany, but it was separated into the four different quadrants, the west side of Berlin, democratic, the east side of Berlin, communist dictatorship. And he surrounds West Berlin. He says, hey, there are people from the west escaping into the east, so we need to police these borders and prevent these people from migrating, whereas in reality that was not true. It was actually people from the east escaping into the west, but that was an embarrassment to the Soviets because the Soviets are the country that are supposed to be the communists, that are fair and nice to everybody. And so if people are fleeing them, then that would indicate that their system doesn't actually work. So in order to prevent this, they surround West Berlin. Now, they also did it because they were trying to starve out the people of West Berlin, so that the people of West Berlin would now be a case study where the Soviets could say, hey, look, these democratic countries don't take care of their own people. In which case, in the midst of this Berlin crisis, this was a significant humanitarian crisis where you got over 1 million people in West Berlin that are going to starve to death. They don't have fuel, they don't have oil, they don't have coal, they don't have food, they don't have any supplies. And we have no means of getting them supplies because at the end of the day, they are surrounded by the Russian military. So how do we do it? And what Truman comes up with, even though it should have honestly been impossible, was the Berlin airlift, where he basically says, all right, we need the U.S. Air Force to start flying in all the supplies they need. And whereas on some level you'd say, well, yeah, obviously, you just fly over it. That's not realistic because there just aren't enough planes. There aren't enough runways. There aren't enough means of getting the supplies into West Berlin that need to be gotten into West Berlin. It's just not feasible by air. There's just no way this can happen, yet Truman tells the military, make it happen. And for over a year, they did. They actually were able to supply the people of West Berlin through this airlift. It's plane after 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 plane. Just continue to fly into the airports of West Berlin and just keep dropping off the stuff they need. And this became just one of the most complicated military operations in world history, as it should not be feasible that this happened. And yet it happened. It worked well. It actually turned the table, where the Soviets realized, my goodness, here we are trying to embarrass Truman, and he's actually embarrassing us, because all we can do at this point is just shoot down these planes. But if we shoot down these planes, it's going to make us look like real bad guys. And so Stalin realized he's been outmaneuvered. So by early 1949, Stalin backs off and quits being aggressive in Berlin. And so by early 1949, it appeared that the Cold War was over. It appeared that this tension that we see with initially Czechoslovakia and Greece, and then France, Italy, Greece, and Turkey, and then the Truman Doctrine stopping them from spreading into Greece and Turkey, and the Marshall Plan stopping them from spreading into all these other countries, and the Berlin airlift showing how the U.S. will do anything by any means necessary to stop him from hurting people. And it really made the U.S. look like good guys, and it really made him look like a bad guy, and it looked like the Cold War had been won. And if it had been won at this point, then it wouldn't be dominating foreign policy for the next 50 years, but obviously it didn't. So what happened that changed the direction of the Cold War? And what ended up happening in 1949, where early in 49, because of the Berlin airlift, it looked like we had won. Truman gets reelected. The Soviets were embarrassed. It looks like they're backing off. But then in 49, two major events are going to turn the tide of the Cold War and take it from this thing that, was a serious concern, but relatively easily addressed, to something that's going to dominate foreign policy for decades. And the first thing is when we receive news that the Soviets test the atomic bomb. And the first question we ask is how? How could the Soviets have the bomb? They were supposed to be backwards. They were supposed to be the second world. Like if you've heard the term first world or second world or third world, those were terms from the Cold War, where the first world were the Western democracies like the US or England or these other countries that are the advanced ones. They have better education, better economies, better governments, better rights, better everything. The second world were the communist states. They were less developed. They had less rights. Their economies were not as advanced. Their people were not as taken care of, not as educated. And then you had the term the third world that people used back in this time period. And this was for the unaffiliated countries, like a lot of the recently decolonized countries in Europe or in Latin America or just all these other countries around the world that were not either clear advanced democracies like the United States or England or clear communist states like the Soviet Union or East Germany at this point. And the Second World was supposed to be behind us. So how did the Soviets get this atomic bomb? And we now know that, they had spies in our country, and whereas they'd been working on their own nuclear technology, their spies did steal some of the information from us that allowed them to develop it. But either way, they had it, and this starts to become a big thing, because before it was like, okay, the Russians might have an army of 10 million men, but we don't care because we can just drop atomic bombs on them if a war ever breaks out. So the fact we had them and they didn't meant they would always be deterred. Like they might do things like the Berlin crisis, but they would never openly attack us because we could blow them up with nuclear weapons. Well, now they have them, and that freaks us out. That scares us, that they could blow us up just as easily. And so it escalates the Cold War dramatically, and there's going to be this arms race that develops to see who's going to win, where it's like, well, if they have the bomb, we need to have more. And then if they're going to have more, then we need to have better. And if they're going to have better, then we need to have more. And then we need to have better ways to deliver them. If we fly them in with planes, they fly them in with more planes. So we need to have rockets. And if you've ever actually read Dr. Seuss's book, The Butter Battle Book, he wrote it about the arms race, where he says, so when does it stop? Like, when does this stop? How does it stop? And I don't know that it does. And that's one of the reasons that the Soviets getting the bomb freaked everybody out. The second major event is when the Chinese Civil War that began all the way back in the 1920s concludes. And it concludes with Mao Zedong winning. So whereas for years we thought Chiang Kai-shek was winning, he had spent during World War II when the Japanese invaded China, a lot of times it was Chiang Kai-shek that was fighting off the Japanese, or at least attempting to. And so we thought, wow, the Chinese people will be loyal to Chiang Kai-shek. And even though he's kind of a ruthless dictator himself, he's also a nationalist. He's not a communist. And so we were willing to support him. But we also didn't support him too much because we didn't think we had to. We thought his government was winning. But then by 1949, the Civil War actually ends, and Chiang Kai-shek did not win. During World War II, while Chiang Kai-shek was fighting, Mao Zedong was back west in the mountains, regrouping, rebuilding, and establishing more of a military force. And so by 1949, Mao Zedong actually conquers the rest of China and establishes the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek has to flee the Chinese mainland with his army and a lot of the money, and he established himself on the island of Formosa that will change its name to Taiwan and become what we say is the actual China. And then the Soviets are mad because they want Mao Zedong's China, headquartered in Beijing, the People's Republic of China, to be the actual China. But because we say that it's the one on Taiwan, there's going to be Chiang Kai-shek's government gets to hold the Chinese seat in the UN Security Council. So they will be recognized as the actual China during this time period by the United Nations, and Mao Zedong's government that controls the vast majority of the Chinese territory and people will be viewed as not the actual China. And this continues to play a role in foreign policy, where, as when Donald Trump got elected in 2016, one of the first things he did was he placed a call to the leader of Taiwan, which a lot of people were offended by. They thought, how could you call him when Mao Zedong, since Richard Nixon's presidency, we've been viewing Mao Zedong's government as the actual government of China, and we deal with them when we're trying to deal with China, not Taiwan. And so that caused some conflict, and obviously Trump has had some ups and downs in his relations with the Chinese government, but it all dates back to this war. And at the end of the day, people start to say, how did we lose China? Who lost China? China was supposed to be this country that was democratic. China was our ally in World War II. China was led by Chiang Kai-shek, we thought. He was a close ally of ours. So now we have two events happening in 49 where the Soviets now have atomic weapons, and the Chinese, the biggest country in the world as far as sheer number of people, they have now become communist. So whereas we thought the Cold War had been won by the Berlin airlift and Berlin crisis, and it was going to be limited to Eastern Europe, now all of a sudden the communist movement has spread into East Asia. And so the next question becomes, we thought Japan was safe. We thought Korea was safe. We thought all these other places were safe. And now maybe they're not. And so people freak out and they get really upset with Truman's presidency because they're saying, you're not stopping communism. We thought you did with the Berlin airlift, but you're not. And so that's going to change foreign policy. A, it's going to lead us more involved in East Asia, and B, it's going to get us to escalate our commitment to the Cold War. And out of this, the National Security Council, a group established during World War II, is going to meet and discuss what do we do. And the National Security Council comes up with a report called National Security Council 68, so that becomes its title, NSC 68, where they say we need to alter our foreign policy. Our foreign policy had been governed by the Truman Doctrine, where it basically said just money, just use money, and aid to countries resisting communism, and containment will work. Well, the NSC 68 document is saying, nope, we need to escalate it. It's saying, no, we need to invest heavily in our military. We need to basically frighten. We need to do this arms race and do it well. We cannot use diplomacy. We cannot use economic means to stop Soviet expansion. We need to use our military. We need to use more aggressive techniques because the Soviets will only learn from one thing. They will not learn from money. They will learn from force. They are an authoritarian government. The only way to stop an authoritarian government is to beat them in a fight. So the NSC document is saying spend more on your military. Then if you have a big enough military, then the Soviets won't even try to expand because they will be scared of you. And so basically what the NSC 68 document becomes is following 1949, the atomic bomb in the Chinese Civil War, we now recognize that the U.S. has to be more aggressive in the way it conducts its foreign policy. Okay. Another thing that we're going to start to do now that we realize communism might be spreading is we're going to start to use international collective security alliances. So on the one hand, Truman was supporting international agreements like the United Nations, the Geneva Convention, the International Monetary Fund, and these were all international agencies designed to keep peace. Well, now we're going to see international agencies designed to deter conflict through the means of collective security. Collective security means defensive alliances. If you remember defensive alliances, like we had in the lead up to World War I, where you had the Central Powers on the one hand, the Allied powers on the other. Well, we're going to start to see the rise of these. And the first of the major ones is going to be NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is going to be a group, as you can see on this map, it's all these dark brown countries, Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, England, France, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal. These are the initial members of NATO. And that's why they're called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because they kind of span the Northern Atlantic area. And the way NATO works is basically if any of these countries get attacked, every member nation defends. It's just like World War I and alliances, right, where the Austro-Hungarians attacked the Serbians, and so the Russians defended, and then the Germans did, and all that stuff. So the same kind of thing here, where now we have this alliance. And this alliance, as you can tell on the map, is going to expand over the years. Eventually Spain will join. Eventually Greece and Turkey will join. Germany will join. West Germany had already joined, but then once Germany becomes Germany again by 1990, the whole country is going to join. Eastern Europe's eventually going to join. So as NATO expands, and that's one of the reasons like why Vladimir Putin and the Russians that have a more traditional mindset of international relations are going to start to really oppose the United States and really kind of stop, because as you can tell, NATO is spreading. Its influence is spreading in Europe, much like Stalin was trying to do in the post-World War II years. And so NATO, this map was done in 2004. It's a little different now, but it's more or less the same, where it's a defensive alliance with Western democracies. Now, whereas Western democracies are expanding into a defensive alliance, we're also going to see the same thing happen with the satellite nations. The satellite nations becomes a term for all those Eastern European countries that surrounded the Soviets, that were all communist. And they're going to create their own version of NATO by 1955 called the Warsaw Pact. And as you can see on the map, it's the Soviet Union themselves, but then also all these countries down here in Eastern Europe: Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and East Germany. Okay, and obviously they're supposed to be the counterbalance, where if any of these Western European countries attack, or the Americans attack, or whatever, all of them would agree to defend. So basically, much like in the lead up to World War I, we now have these defensive alliances forming. So basically what 1949 does is you have NSC 68 saying, hey, you need to really build up your military, and then groups like NATO and the Warsaw Pact, you need to create defensive alliances. So basically it looks like the lead up to World War I all over again. So this is what the Cold War is. And the most famous manifestation of this NSC 68 document and just the new direction of foreign policy following 1949 is going to be what happens in Korea. Okay, so Korea, many of you know, is a peninsula that it comes off of Manchuria, the northeastern province of China. Okay, it's right across from Japan. There's Japan over there, and there's Manchuria up there, and there's the Korean peninsula there. Okay, now Korea, you need to understand the background. At different points in its history, have been an independent country. The Korean people are distinctly different from the Japanese and the Chinese people. They've had their own government at different times. At times, the Chinese have ruled over them, or the Mongols. At times, the Japanese have tried to rule over them, especially in the 20th century, where the Japanese basically take Korea as a result of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 95. And so the Japanese had occupied them for many years at this point. Well, after World War II, we occupied Japan, and we basically create a free Korea. And this free Korea is going to be a Korea that is divided at the 38th parallel. Okay, now whereas on the one hand, you had the Soviet Union and backing North Korea. And so North Korea was going to be a communist state led by the grandfather of Kim Jong-un. And their capital will be in Pyongyang, as most of you know. It's right there on the map. And South Korea would be the Democratic Korea. Okay, and we will support their government that is headquartered in Seoul, which is right there. Okay, and what was supposed to happen in 1950, so this is basically a joint occupation where North Korea becomes communist and the South Koreans are democratic. And there's going to be an election, supposedly in 1950, where the Korean people, both North and South, vote. And when they have the vote, whoever wins gets to control Korea. Well, as the election looked like it was breaking out, the polls were all indicating that the Democratic candidates were going to win and win big, because communism doesn't really establish a better economy. And so a lot of the people in the North were suffering. They didn't really like the government in Pyongyang, many of them. And a lot of the people in the South did. And the South had a little bit more population anyway. And so it looked like Korea was going to become a democratic country. And that's when June of 1950 hit. For as this election approaches, the North Koreans say, nope, we're not going to have an election. And they invade the South. So basically what you see in June of 1950, the North Korean army moves into southern Korea. And they're going to push the South Korean military all the way back to this little pocket around the city of Busan. Okay, so the North Koreans basically conquer South Korea in the initial month of June. And that's when the United Nations step in. The United Nations, whose whole job is to not let things like this happen, decide to vote. The Security Council votes. And the Security Council decides to have what's called the police action. That's what a lot of history books would refer to it, where they're going to send a peacekeeping force into South Korea to push the North Koreans back out. That, like the police, they're going to come to restore order. And they will. And the Security Council votes. They agree that they're going to do this. Now, the Soviet Union would have vetoed this decision, but the Soviets weren't there to veto it, because the Soviets had been boycotting the Security Council. And they were boycotting the Security Council because they were mad that in 1949, the Security Council had voted and the UN General Council had voted that Chiang Kai-shek's government would be the Chinese representative on the Security Council and in the United Nations. And so the Soviets weren't there to veto it. Chiang Kai-shek's government did not veto it, obviously, because they supported the U.S. And so the UN agrees they will have a police action where a UN peacekeeping force will go into South Korea and restore order. And it's going to be led by General Douglas MacArthur. There's a picture of him, the hero from World War II, who had more or less won the war in the Pacific against the Japanese. And over 80% of this army, that's going to have hundreds of thousands of soldiers, is going to be U.S. soldiers. So basically, the U.S. is going to have a draft and send a bunch of soldiers. Australia will send some, Britain will send some, other countries will send some. But the U.S. leads this police action, and most of the troops are U.S. soldiers. And in September of 1950, they're going to invade. We're going to send some troops into the Pusan pocket over here, but then there's also going to be this landing at Incheon. Incheon is this city just west of Seoul, and it's this amphibious invasion. And with Douglas MacArthur invading, what should have been impossible, it was a really complicated military operation that he pulls off. But he's going to be able to get the U.S. military, UN military, mostly U.S., back here behind the enemy lines of the North Koreans. He's going to be able to have the U.S. Army prop up here, and with the North Koreans surrounded, they're going to have to evacuate North Korea. And the UN is going to be destroying them and pushes them all the way up to this blue line that you can see all the way at the top. As you can see, this is the farthest UN advance in 1950. And they actually approach the Yalu River, the river that separates China from Korea. And as they approach the Yalu River, the Chinese government in Beijing under Mao Zedong sent a message where they say, if the UN army approaches the Yalu River, we're going to take that as evidence that you are trying to conquer China. And so when the UN army does get up there, the Chinese of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong's government, is going to launch an invasion of North Korea, where over 800,000 Chinese soldiers are going to invade North Korea. And they're going to push all the way back to about here. Okay, and so Douglas MacArthur's army gets pushed to about midway in South Korea, where they're going to regroup, and they're going to push all the way back to this truce line that is labeled right here, okay, the black line on this map. And here a stalemate ensues. Okay, and as the stalemate ensues, where we cannot push them any further because the Chinese just have too many soldiers there, and they cannot push us any further as our military kind of entrenched this position, MacArthur comes up with a plan. And his plan is to raise up an army of over 1 million men to invade mainland China. So they're going to send the army over to mainland China while also nuking I think it was the 39 largest cities in China. This would have killed millions and millions and millions and millions of people, as MacArthur was going to use this situation in North Korea as an excuse to basically conquer mainland China and restore mainland China to Chiang Kai-shek's rule. And at this point, Truman told him, no, that's crazy. We are here for, as the UN said, a police action. We're here to just get the North Koreans out of South Korea. And we've done it, right? We have pushed them basically out of South Korea. In fact, we've taken some of the North Korean territory from them. But MacArthur says, no, we should try to win this war. If the Chinese attack us, we should attack them. And MacArthur is told by Truman to stop making comments like this, whereas there were people in America that were like, yeah, go blow them up. Truman said, no, this is crazy. It's going to lead to just this massive humanitarian crisis of epic proportions where we kill all these people. But Truman tells him that. MacArthur says no. MacArthur even goes to the media and says, hey, Truman's trying to tell me not to do this. So at that point, Truman has to fire MacArthur. And with MacArthur fired, Truman basically appoints a more loyal commander in charge of the army. And this war is going to stalemate for the next 3 years. So basically, for 3 years, there's not much fighting. You got the North Korean and Chinese army on this side of the line. You've got the U.S. army on this side of the line. And that's where the war stagnates. And as the war stagnates, a lot of people look at Truman. And looking back, I mean, he probably did the right thing. There's almost no way you can justify killing the tens of millions of people that would have died had we gone to war with China. But a lot of Americans were disappointed in him. They're saying, hey, you lost China. Hey, you allowed the Soviets to get the atomic bomb. Your fair deal's not accomplishing what we hoped it would accomplish. Truman, you are a failed president. You need to get out of office. And so Truman will not run for re-election in 1952. And in 1952, we're going to have an election where the dominant issue of the time period is the Korean War. can somebody come in and quote unquote win it, which a lot of Americans would define win it as retake all of North Korea. Now, to go ahead and spoil the ending here, that's not how it ends. Dwight Eisenhower gets elected. Dwight Eisenhower will go negotiate with the Koreans, and basically what they agree to is that there will be two countries in Korea. You will have North Korea and you will have South Korea, even though that's not actually their names.